A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I've always considered myself a rational person, never one to delve too deeply into the supernatural. However, the past few weeks have shaken the foundations of my reality and my skepticism. It all began when I received an old, dusty lamp in the mail, an anonymous gift delivered without a return address. Giggles of excitement escaped me as I polished the lamp as a joke, whispers of childhood fantasies dancing through my mind. To my utter shock, a swirling cloud of darkness erupted, forming into a figure, a genie, its presence somehow both chilling and mesmerizing. Now, what I found strange was the genie didn't offer me wishes. Instead, it simply laughed, a low, reverberating sound that seemed to echo through my bones. Then it vanished just as quickly as it appeared, leaving me with an unsettling sense of dread. A week later, as I was trying to dismiss the lamp incident as a dream or hallucination, my phone rang. It was from an unknown number, and the voice on the other end was a lisping whisper, repeating the phrase, "The wish has been made." Goosebumps prickled my skin, but I had no idea what the message meant until strange things began to happen. It started subtly, doors that I knew I had locked left swinging open, items disappearing only to reappear in odd places. Soon, though, the occurrences escalated. I'd wake up to find strange symbols drawn on my walls, written in what appeared to be my own blood, though I had no injuries. Paranoia crept into every corner of my mind as I began to feel eyes constantly watching me. I started seeing shadowy figures in my peripheral vision, but whenever I turned my head, they vanished. One night, my reflection in the mirror didn't mimic my movements. Instead, it grinned widely, its eyes alight with a sinister gleam that wasn't my own. Desperate for answers, I trawled the internet for any hint, any clue, or similar stories. Eventually, in a sketchy forum, I found an obscure thread, an ancient lore describing how genies could not just grant wishes, but inversely, could fulfill the darkest desires of others upon us. Someone had indeed made a wish for my demise. Sleep-deprived and terrified, I sought help from a so-called paranormal expert. He advised me to find the wisher soon, for as long as the wish remained unfulfilled, I'd be hunted relentlessly by misfortune. He described a ritual to trace back the curse's origin, a ceremony as baffling as it was terrifying. With no other options, I followed his instructions, using the accursed lamp, candles, and the blood tempo of a midnight heartbeat. As I performed the ritual, the world flickered, and I found myself in a void, standing before the genie, its eyes glowing with malevolent amusement. "Who wished for my death?" I demanded. The genie cackled, its voice resonating like a crypt song, a soul with a heart full of envy and a mind touched by madness. The scene shifted, and before me appeared an acquaintance from college, someone I barely remembered, a person whose name I had to strain to recall, Ben, a guy I'd helped occasionally with assignments. His life had fallen apart after college, jobs fretted away, relationships splintered, envy fermented and twisted into hate. He had found the lamp years prior, used his wish, and the genie had waited patiently for the chance to execute this dark desire. Heart pounding, I realized I needed to confront Ben. Tracking him down was surprisingly easy, given his down-and-out public social media cries for validation and vengeance. Cornering him in his shabby apartment, I revealed everything: the genie's existence, the curse, and his damning wish. His eyes widened, horror mingling with guilt as he broke down, admitting he'd wished it in a moment of despair, thinking it an impossible landmark of his hate. Ben and I returned to my place. I insisted he needed to rescind the wish. In a final standoff with the ethereal presence, Ben fell to his knees, weeping, pleading for the genie to revoke his wish. I watched as the air shimmered, the room darkened, and finally, after an agonizing pause, the genie acquiesced with a grudging whisper that felt like a storm receding. The sinister occurrences around me ceased immediately. The relief was palpable, the weight of doom lifted. If I learned anything, it's that darkness lurks not in the shadows cast by the lamp's light but in the shadows of human hearts. Even the playful notion of wish fulfillment can become a nightmare when tainted by envy. Now, as I stare at the cursed lamp sealed in a concrete block, soon to be sunk into the sea, I decide to break my rule and share what happened. Because everyone has secrets they wish they could have answered, but some secrets are better left buried. Things had been tense between Kelly and me ever since the engagement. Karen, Kelly's mother, had disapproved from day one. She believed I wasn't career-focused enough for her daughter, which was ironic given that my startup was finally taking off. My relationship with Kelly seemed like a perfect story, college sweethearts who defied odds and family expectations to be together. But Karen's hovering presence constantly loomed over us like a storm about to break. Our engagement was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance for happiness, yet when Karen unexpectedly passed away, everything turned upside down. One night, just after dinner, Kelly asked if I would help pay for Karen's funeral. The words left me stunned. It wasn't that I couldn't afford it, the startup had its ups and downs, but I could manage. It was the principle of it. Karen had never treated me with an ounce of kindness or respect. Every holiday, every birthday, she found ways to insult me in ways that Kelly always seemed to dismiss as her stress talking. Despite all this, I had tried to be understanding, putting on a brave face for Kelly's sake. Now, it felt like a final betrayal, a strange request from the love of my life but in some twisted shape that no longer felt loving, more like an obligation. Kelly's plea echoed around my mind, she didn't have much, and it's the least we can do. We. That word stung, as if now I were suddenly part of a collective unity that, when it came to Karen, had always been absent. I tried to reason through my conflicting feelings, muttering something about how I would think about it, knowing in my gut my answer was likely a solid no. The night stretched on with its oppressive silence. Kelly retreated to the bedroom, leaving me alone with my thoughts, the flickering light of the TV the only companion. It was then that I noticed the cold air in the room, despite the furnace working. The temperature had dipped unnaturally, sending a shiver twisting up my spine. The pictures on the walls, their occupants staring vacantly, deepened the unease that danced along my conscious mind. Just as I dismissed it as nothing more than a freak draft, the light flickered once more before plunging the room into darkness. A power outage? Yet it felt more personal, somehow. The atmosphere grew heavy, pressing against my temples as my own heartbeat filled the silence. Fumbling for the flashlight on the coffee table, I called out to Kelly, but she didn't respond. The feeble beam cut through the dark, casting long shadows that seemed to quiver with life. As my eyes adjusted, I saw her, Karen, or at least something that wore her face. She stood by the window, illuminated by the ambient glow of the streetlights filtering in. Her expression was twisted in hatred, every part of her resonating the disdain she'd shown in life but now magnified, amplified. She didn't move, didn't speak, yet a voice filled my head, dripping with contempt and malice. For all you took from her, you owe her this much. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath quickening as I stumbled away. This wasn't real, couldn't be real. The specter vanished as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving me shaking, questioning my sanity. But the chill remained, permeating the very air. Kelly was still not responding, and a dread clawed its way through me as I pushed the bedroom door. It opened softly to reveal her peacefully asleep, completely unaware of the turmoil that had taken place within our home. I couldn't bring myself to wake her, not like this. Instead, I lay beside her, eyes fixed on the ceiling, chaos swirling in my mind. The next few days were a blur. Kelly seemed oblivious, completely and mercifully unaware of what I had witnessed. Karen's funeral approached, every step toward it feeling like it pulled me, dragged me toward an abyss I feared to name. As much as I tried to convince myself it was all stress, all the hallucination of a mind overworked, depleted, the memory clung to me. Every shadow seemed to hide her, every cold draft was a whisper of her presence. The day of the funeral arrived under gray skies threatening rain. I decided, in a moment of clarity or perhaps surrender, that I would contribute. Not because she had convinced me in life or even in that haunting moment, but because Kelly deserved peace. The ceremony was a somber affair, hushed tones and stolen glances that I pretended not to notice. As we laid her to rest, the clouds broke and the first drops of rain fell, mingling with silent tears. I would never tell Kelly what I saw, not fully. Instead, I held her hand, shared her grief, and whispered reassurances against the cold reality of our shared silence. Yet, every so often, in the quiet moments when the world fades, I feel a chill, a reminder of that darkened room, of promises extracted from the depths of fear. And as much as I want to believe in moving on, some specters never fully release their hold. It all started the night I found Sarah lifeless on the living room floor, eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. My heart seized as I knelt beside her, shaking her shoulders, calling her name over and over. No response. No pulse. Cold. I don't really remember what happened after that. It's all a hazy whirl of panic, the desperate fumbling for my phone, dialing 911, and the helpless hours waiting in stark hospital corridors. The doctors said they couldn't find a cause of death, which twisted my grief into a darker shade of confusion until I did something I never thought I'd do. I went home, sat in our shared silence, and scoured through her things, desperate for answers. That's when I stumbled upon her journal wedged underneath the mattress on her side of the bed. The pages were filled with her handwriting, but as I read, It became chillingly clear these were not the musings of a woman in distress, but a collection of memories that weren't quite hers. First, they seemed like normal entries, birthday parties, vacations, mundane reflections about work and us, but as I delved deeper, the ink communicated a life unfamiliar to Sarah, a life where she'd never met me, details of childhood events she'd never mentioned, entire lifetimes she'd supposedly lived, none involving our life together. Each journal entry felt as if it was penned in another dimension, until I came across yesterday's date. There, in eerie precision, she described how I'd find her unresponsive on the floor, and that this was just as it should be. The reality pierced me as if shot by an invisible arrow. My wife had been a ghost writing her own existence. She wove tales for herself in overlapping realities. I dropped the journal in shock as the room spun around me. Then, as if commanded by an unseen script, I was drawn to her computer, her email marked drafts as if glowing. One draft was devoid of the usual pleasantries. To me, it felt like a confessional, more than a message. In maddening detail, it unraveled her life as an experiment, governed by something or someone beyond my comprehension. It insinuated I was an unwitting participant, cocooned in an elaborate illusion of love, and eerily suggested neither of us were truly alive, just echoes of a greater consciousness whims. As these truths incubated my newfound paranoia, the reality I clung to fragmented. A phone call with her mother insisting Sarah had no siblings when I distinctly remembered visiting a sister's gravesite with Sarah, the sudden absence of our wedding photos from every corner of our home, our neighbor recoiling in confusion when I asked about the block party they hosted just last month, which now they denied ever having planned. I felt the walls closing in, like an actor gripping at the fourth wall, begging for soliloquy. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, only peer over the edge of my sanity into the abyss of possibility that our entire life together might be a deranged fiction. Then, came the final email, new, and only partly formed, as if it had written itself, a collection of timestamps, culminating in one-line conclusions that demanded the attendance of audiences in other realms. My heart dropped as I realized these audiences might just be those who are living our story, observing us, passing off our fears, our sufferings as entertainment. As of this morning, Sarah's body is gone without a trace, the police just another actor refusing to remember her existence, the house void of all evidence she resided within these walls. With each tick of the clock, I feel my own tangible sense of being slipping, a mere performer outlasting his epilogue. In the corners of this draft are whispers of endings and beginnings, a design suggesting this confession will eventually abduct me from my tether of sanity into the audience's embrace. I have no proof of my utterances, no photos, no forgotten keepsakes save for a fading scent on her pillow, just this typed echo, tirelessly reaching out. But I realize now, none of it matters, because in reality, our existence, my existence, might simply be a page you turn, a story you read before bed. As I press send, I wonder if winding your disbelief into belief might be the only real possession I have left. After all, in a world where the lines between life, death, and fantasy blur, who can truly say what never was? I never expected the worst day of my life to start with a simple post on Reddit. On the outside, my sister Emily and I seemed like a typical pair of siblings. We had our disagreements and diffs, but we always found a way back to each other. That was until last Christmas, when the world as I knew it was about to unravel in terrifying ways. Emily and I had always been close growing up. She was 5 years older, the overachiever who set the bar impossibly high for everyone else in the family. I took comfort in my role as the laid-back, somewhat aloof younger brother. But things changed when Emily got married and soon after, to her joy and everyone else's delight, announced her pregnancy. That happiness turned into despair when she had a miscarriage. It was devastating, a punch to the gut that knocked the wind out of our entire family. In the weeks that followed, Emily was understandably inconsolable, shrouded in a fog of grief I'd never seen her in before. Initially, I was nothing but sympathetic, doing whatever I could to help her bear the load. Our family rallied around her, though it always seemed like nothing we did was enough. Emily withdrew from us, sinking deeper into her own world of pain where none of us could reach her. Months passed, yet her grief didn't lighten, something in her remained fixated on that heart-rending loss to an extent that even family therapy couldn't touch. Then came the day that started it all. It was a regular Sunday afternoon, the sort that blends into hundreds you've lived through before. The winter sun painted ghostly shapes on the walls of my dimly lit apartment as I made half-hearted attempts at tidying up. My phone buzzed with a notification from Emily. "Are you coming over for dinner tonight?" I paused. Emily's dinner invitations had become more frequent, each one drenched in layers of expectation that silently asserted her need for attention. Each gathering turned into some deranged ritualistic commemoration of the life never lived, with Emily occupying the role of high priestess. I'd reached my breaking point. Against my better judgment, I decided to speak with her. "Emily, you need to move on," I texted back hesitantly. "The world doesn't revolve around your miscarriage." As soon as the text sent, a wave of cold dread washed over me. I'd never spoken to her like that, blunt, unsparing. Her reply came almost instantaneously, an empty void of ellipses, followed by a deafening silence. Dinner came and went without much fanfare. I received no wrathful calls, no furious knocks at my door, just nothingness that felt unsettling at its core. That night in bed, sleep refused to come. My brain was a whirlwind of guilt and apprehension. Around 3 a.m., my phone vibrated on my nightstand with a text. It was from an unknown number, a series of encrypted letters that made no sense, garbled and out of order. Confused and curious in equal measure, I stared at it, piecing it together until I realized they were anagrams for Heaven's Echo. Puzzled but overwhelmingly compelled, I typed the phrase into my search bar, finding a no-name chatroom populated with obscure, disparate posts that seemed piecemeal at best. The most recent entry stopped me cold. It was a transcript of my dinner conversation with Emily, word for word, including my ill-considered text. Heart-pounding, I scrolled further, noticing threads that eerily mirrored recent conversations with her, the sort only she and I knew about. The room felt smaller as the air thickened with my racing heartbeats. In hindsight, I should have stopped there, maybe shown it to her as some deranged prank, but curiosity, mixed with gut-twisting horror, got the better of me. Following post after post down the rabbit hole of mystery, it became apparent that I was being watched, recorded by someone who knew our secrets, or something. The clock ticked incessantly towards morning, and as the first light of dawn seeped through my windows, I knew what I had to do. It was time to confront Emily. Fraught with exhaustion and dread, I arrived at her house as shadows of the new day edged into existence. A storm of emotions played on her face as she opened the door, but there was also something else, a chilling calm as if she were expecting me. I struggled to tell her what I'd discovered, poised between anguish and apprehension on her threshold. Her eyes bored into mine, an unsettling smile that sent shivers up my spine curving her lips. Then she said, "You're not the first to see it." The sentence hung in the air, fraught with cloudy ambiguity, and she motioned for me to enter. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, almost oppressive. The house was dim, the drapes drawn. On a coffee table sat several children's toys, ones they'd bought for the baby when it had still been a reality. Emily didn't have to explain further. She'd been delving into the chat room long before my foray, feeding the remnants of her grief to an audience she claimed understood her better than anyone. As Emily recounted her story, a revelation unfolded, a chain letter, a digital haunt, crafted by those whose grief drew them to edge of darkness, promising connection beyond conventional comprehension. The Echoes of Heaven, they called it, a space built on the collective lament of unfinished lives seeking acknowledgement. The people posting and watching aren't quite people anymore, she confessed, belonging to something undefined, like a coalescence of trapped souls trying to cope. I felt the air thin around me, disorientation washed over, followed by Emily's voice, distant and disconnected, urging me to join her, become part of this new family she had embraced. In tears, I realized she was too far gone, ensnared by something eldritch and insidious. I tried, maybe too late, to save her from herself, but felt her slipping even further away as if vanishing into shadows, her presence flickering like static on an unsettled screen. Overwhelmed by the encroaching danger I couldn't quite name, I backed out of the house, my escape frantic, a beating retreat into coherence. Once outside, the world felt normal again, sunlight mingling with fear on my skin. I knew I had lost Emily to something that blurs the lines between grief and horror. The chatroom remains live, tethering me and others who dare enter to an existence diverging from linear reality. I remain haunted by the thought that's turned my nights cold and hollow. Maybe she wasn't the one I was trying to save. When I was 7, my older sister, Elara, showed me the first of many dark and inexplicable cruelties she would inflict upon me. It was a sweltering summer afternoon when she beckoned me into the cramped, dusty attic, her voice a sweet melody concealing venom. The moment I crossed the threshold, she shut the creaky wooden door behind us, plunging the room into an eerie dimness save for a narrow shaft of light piercing through a tiny window. Her smile was something I'd grown wary of, too wide, too bright, as if her joy fed on my discomfort. In her hand, unusually pale in the subdued light, she held a small, mushy bird, its lifeless body dangling limply. "Look what I've found," she cooed, her fingers flexing around its small frame. And I realized with a shiver that she intended me to feel its brittleness, its stillness. That was the genesis of my secret. Over the years, she became adroit at tormenting me with twisted games and errands, whispering threats I didn't fully comprehend but feared deeply enough to obey. At school, to everyone else, she was the accomplished elder sibling, the epitome of academic brilliance and extracurricular allure. At home, she was a ghost haunting my aspirations for normalcy, a predator stalking the shadows of my childhood. When I approached our parents, their belief in Elara's saintly disposition eclipsed my plea. The sharp rebuke in their eyes sent me spiraling into silence, reaffirming my position as a fluctuating variable in Elara's sadistic calculus. As the years blurred, routine encounters at home, innocuous to the unseeing, transformed into strategic ambushes, meticulously orchestrated scenarios intended to belittle, erode, seize power over me. Tripping me discreetly when relatives were over, sowing doubt in teachers' minds with those meticulous tales spun with calculated precision, each act was a ritual dissection of my spirit. Her psychological shackles tightened when she subtly started manipulating my friendships, sowing discord with an artfulness that bewildered and bruised my sense of belonging. Yet, recounting these tales, I remind myself that it was the dinner party 5 years ago, a famous crux point, that undid me. Elara, now thriving in her respectability, had gathered the family, her friends, colleagues, peacocking before them while I merely hovered by the fringes, a peripheral shadow in her well-lit world. That night, within the falsely jovial confines of our dining room, something snapped. I don't quite recall what prompted the exchange, perhaps it was the wine, or the sheer weight of her blithe omnipresence that had me confronting her. Words tumbled out, a torrent of repressed confessions, her malice, her despotism, my silent suffering, all threadbare and exposed. The room shifted uneasily, and in that spotlight, Elara's charm faltered for just a fraction of a heartbeat, a flicker of the truth. I had expected vindication, a collective understanding, yet was met with the cold eye glare of collective disbelief and suspicion. Elara, ever the master of manipulation, rode the storm with tears, ingeniously turning the tables, fashioning my breakdown as an unfortunate, unprovoked outburst. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, a melodrama of concern, with tender reassurances muting any residual doubts among our guests. For every scream for help paralyzed behind my lips, Elara had a ready, meticulously curated counter-narrative. The psychology of her tactics lay in their cunning simplicity, like a stealthy poison administered drop by drop, killing not the body but the spirit. Retreating into the folds of apology, feigned smiles stitched up my lips, grim acceptance blanketed my logic. Alone with my thoughts once more, my reality twisted inward, curled around my heart, a silent resentment I dare not nourish lest I implode. Yet tonight, a decade past that pivotal night, the shadows she's laying are no longer my shackles but my stepping stones. It started with a simple journal, idle scrawling thoughts expanded into conversations with those tethered to their own tales of malice and oddity. Strangers became allies, my whispered truths echoed in other unheard voices across boards, stories like pebbles cascading into the vast ocean of shared understanding. The irony hasn't escaped me, perhaps Elara's inadvertently given me clarity, gifting me insight into the minds of those who bask in darkness. The shadow of her legacy remains, echoing in the spaces between memory and reality as I pen these words. Not for justice or vengeance, these are aspirations for the unwounded, but for delineation, for acceptance of the void she created. So, when you ask why my sister abused me, the only solace I find nestles in the ambiguity of human capacity, beyond comprehension, beyond justification, an enigma I've learned to unravel, paradoxically, while bound tightly within its snares. Sam and I had been together for 3 years when I stumbled upon the first hint of our unraveling. A routine evening, the sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky in shades of navy and plum. Sam was in the shower when his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, a notification so persistent it breached my attention as I mindlessly scrolled through social media. It was a message preview from an unknown contact, "Can't wait to see you again." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach, a leaden weight that warned me against opening it, but my fingers moved independently of my conscience, interacting with the screen to reveal a conversation steeped in intimacy and lies. It turned out Sam had an entire life I wasn't aware of, a life textured with secret rendezvous, whispers on the phone, and affectionate exchanges with someone he described as the one who truly understands me and messages he never expected me to see. My heart twisted, a visceral knot of betrayal, disbelief, and aching anger, as I scrolled through each exchange, vividly painting a picture of infidelity in my mind. Each word I read was a dagger, twisting and turning in a wound that would not close. Sam emerged from the shower, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my calm facade. I confronted him in a soft voice, fearing my own rage. "Who is she?" I asked, my tone steady despite the quiver in my core. For a moment, Sam's expression held genuine surprise, which quickly melted into the contrived demeanor he donned when caught out, a well-rehearsed mix of contrition and rationalization. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered, averting his gaze, trying to reclaim supremacy over a script that he'd lost control of. But perhaps the most chilling part of it all was how easily he slipped into the role of the aggrieved, victimized by circumstance itself. "I was going to tell you," he claimed, a lie rehearsed down to the furrow of his brows, "but things got complicated." His words were as hollow as they were perfunctory, staining the space between us with insincerity. I wish the betrayal ended there, a transgression found, confronted, and left to flounder in the past. But Sam's treachery was a many-headed beast. A few weeks later, as I sat alone in silence, cobbling together the frayed threads of trust with flimsy determination, the police arrived at our door. "Is this a good time, miss?" the officers asked, their uniforms etched with authority and edges of concern. The question bounced around my mind like a rubber ball in an empty room. Nothing about any of this was good. The officers, a man and a woman, proceeded to unfold a narrative that was like hearing a nightmare with waking ears. Sam was wanted for questioning in connection to a fraud investigation, tied up in expensive hobbies and the kind of reckless spendings that ordinary lives cannot accommodate without consequence. Among the list of transgressions was his artful deception in siphoning funds from my savings account, our savings account, he always insisted. A pool of pooled resources evaporated under his dripping deceit. Those quiet, chilling evenings post-revelation were some of the loneliest I've ever endured. I couldn't keep the tears from coming, an incessant stream of despair that threatened to drown me in their relentless tide. I filed through his possession like a detective, no, worse, a scorned lover, each artifact of his belonging inseminated with dark secrets and untold betrayals. Samuel Worthington, the quintessential partner I'd trusted and loved, materialized as a master illusionist whose greatest trick was that he ever loved me at all. But revelations were not limited to heartbreak. Digging deeper into Sam's duplicity was like opening Pandora's box. I found envelopes filled with false documents, an old laptop that had served as a hub for networks I couldn't comprehend, yet feared for their import. The more I uncovered, the wider the scope of Sam's betrayals spanned. It was as though beneath our quite meticulously curated life lay darker labyrinthine corridors he never wanted me to find, corridors filled with echoes of past indiscretions and the uncanny scent of moral decay. Rumors spread quickly once Sam's misdemeanors became public. Our neighborhood, once a bastion of community spirit, buzzed with whispered judgments and cautionary tales. "Did you hear?" they would mutter, watching me through lowered lids. "You never really know someone, do you?" They were right, and that truth was a festering wound I lived with daily. Sam fled, the coward that he was, abandoning me to the unpleasant aftertaste of our shared history, and the cold shoulders of once friends. Days blurred into one another as I battled through legal ramifications that were mine only by association, but no less impactful. I hired a private investigator, not as an act of vengeance, but to understand who this stranger I'd loved truly was. Aided by professionals who specialized in truths brought to light from shadowy pasts, the investigator unspooled a lifetime of deception. I learned of the other aliases Sam used, identities he assumed with unsettling ease to slip in and out of boundaries society failed to recognize. His exploits spanned beyond fraud, into territories darker than I dared to imagine, predation, theft, and a misuse of trust so vile, its movie script-like quality belied its reality. Yet the louder story seemed to weave its own narrative, ink-whispering tales of deceit until Sam was more ghost than man, vanishing into obscurity as clandestine as his love was false. Friends I'd known, and who thought they'd known Sam as well, vacillated between pity and avoidance, unwilling to introduce such corruption into their pristine lives. But their cautious distance was nothing compared to the silence that followed the media attention his case attracted, when I watched talking heads deliberate over his villainy, talking as though he was no more than a plot, a scripted tale of human folly. Every mention of his name was like a stab in the side, a reminder of wounds too fresh to heal. In their wake, I became both infamous and infamous, someone known only in the margin of someone else's headline story. Alone, while screens blared his misdeeds, I internally screamed for answers that no longer mattered. In my ongoing solitude, I prepared myself to confront a reality where closure might never exist, an existence diminished by someone else's supposed love. But as I closed the book on our once happy partnership, I realized the most important chapter lay ahead. I retreated into the familiar comfort of anonymity, reclaiming corners of the life Sam had sought to dismantle. Piece by piece, I rediscovered myself amidst the rubble of his betrayals. It was a slow, unraveling journey, punctuated by brushes with intrusive memories, but forward was the only direction left to me. I told and retold my story to myself, the words losing weight with each iteration, freeing me from their grip. Sam's confession, as much a condemnation of his character as a grim realization of my own blindness, was the weapon I wielded to carve out a life shaped by unyielded resilience. And so I emerged, not unscathed, but braver in my tarnished skin, afraid still of the shadows others might cast, yet emboldened by the light I could orchestrate myself. A whisper of my story calls to me now. It is time for the closed to reopen, for the forgotten to remain as lessons branded into my soul. So, Sam, wherever you are, hear me clearly. You're a terrible person and a terrible partner. But in your selfish departure, you inadvertently taught me how to recognize strength where it lay dormant. So thank you, I suppose, for waking me up from a dream disguised as a nightmare, echoing lessons only learned through facing the dark. We were experienced hikers, a close-knit group bound by our love for the wilderness and the thrill of finding paths untrodden. Our latest expedition was to a secluded range known as Whispering Pines, a place steeped in eerie local legends. We dismissively brushed off the tales told by the old-timers at the base village, superstitions about voices carried on the wind, and shadows that slipped through the trees like living things. The first 2 days were textbook perfect, until the third morning, when Caleb vanished without a trace. It happened so quickly, so surreptitiously, that we initially couldn't believe it. We'd made camp near a pristine lake under the boughs of ancient pines, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and the distant call of a solitary owl. Caleb was always the early riser, the first to stretch his legs, usually back with fresh water and a grin before the rest of us even stirred. But by the time the sun crested the mist, and there was still no sign of him, unease began to settle in. His pack was untouched, coffee unbrewed, habits uncharacteristic of our punctual friend. After calling his name into the silence yielded nothing more than echoes, we split up into pairs to search, trying to stow away the spiraling worry that started to churn in our gut. Tessa and I headed east towards the grove where a stream cut through the woods. Our eyes scanned for broken branches, footprints, anything, but the forest seemed to have swallowed him whole. Meanwhile, Eric and Julie went west, their voices faint and distant. Hours passed, the forest closing in tighter by the minute with a strange oppressive atmosphere engulfing what normally was our playground. The land seemed to shift beneath our feet, familiar landmarks turned strange, paths doubled back on themselves impossibly, and we'd catch fleeting glimpses of movement at the edges of our vision. By the time we regrouped, the sun was low, our nerves taut. Eric was unusually quiet, a shadow crossing his face as if he had caught the scent of something ominous. Julie's attempt at levity was stilted, cracking under tension as she joked weakly that maybe Caleb had just gotten cold feet and headed home. Night fell sharp and sudden, with a chill that had us drawing closer to the fire we'd built out of necessity rather than comfort. Whispering Pines had developed an auditory personality, soft sighs and an occasional haunting rustle that felt unnervingly personal. Just when weariness began to drag at our eyes, an all too familiar voice called out faintly from the woods. Caleb's voice. Relief washed over us, instinctively pulling us to our feet. But Tessa grabbed my arm, halting me with wide eyes. "Listen," she whispered urgently. The eerie note in that familiar call was undeniable. A quiver in the cadence that touched on something old and primal, something we shouldn't have been able to hear. Eric, putting on a brave face, called out, assuring Caleb we would come to get him, but just beyond the ring of firelight, where the trees loomed like great dark sentinels, Caleb's voice echoed again, hollow and wrong. We sat, paralyzed by instinct screaming that something wasn't right, until all at once, the voices stopped, leaving us stranded in deafening silence. Sleep was impossible that night as every creak and crack seemed amplified, each whisper of the branches sounding suspiciously like someone sneaking closer. Hours dripped by agonizingly slow, and by dawn's pallid light, we resolved to retrace our steps back to the village for help. Navigation was inexplicably difficult this time, the forest a labyrinth that delighted in confusion. What trails remained unblocked taunted us with surreal disorientation. We should have reached civilization by midday, yet we only stumbled deeper into this natural maze. Then, on the supposed path home, we found Caleb's compass smashed, reflecting the dull glow of the dismal sky, a chilling homage that rooted us in dread. Desperation clouded our minds, whispering dark desires of distrust and fear, as if this forest sought to unravel the threads binding us together. The final day blurred into night again, an eternal twilight under the canopy. We clung to each other not out of camaraderie but for fear of becoming the next to vanish. As we huddled together, we debated not just the real horrors of exposure and dehydration, but the lurking terror of Caleb's voice, which now returned, mocking, shifting timber as if trying on skins. Eric, eyes wild with fraying sanity, claimed the trees whispered to him, claimed they knew the paths and the terrible fate that would keep us here. Julie begged him to stay silent, to not acknowledge whatever had taken Caleb, lest it finds us suitable replacements. A storm rolled in after midnight, thunder roaring a twisted lullaby while wind howled through the branches, drowning out even our panicked voices. As lightning illuminated the surroundings, we saw silhouettes within the trees, figures that mirrored those who had gone missing in these woods years before, if village lore was to be believed. Tessa clutched my hand with a grip so fierce it spoke of unvoiced terror, and when dawn arrived again, in hues now tinged with the surreal shift of reality, we stumbled upon a small clearing none of us remembered seeing. There, center-focused in stark contrast to the vibrant grass, was Caleb's water bottle, its presence a sinister beacon marking our passage from the known into the inexplicable. We never saw Caleb again. When we reached the village, looking like specters, babbling about what we had endured, dismissive eyes met our desperate tales. They wrapped around us, the comfort of civilization, but could not chase away the creeping realization that those woods wanted something, needed something, and our presence had fed its hunger in a way none of us could articulate. The stories told in whispering tones in the bars and around campfires now held new weight in our hearts, for we had left a piece of our sanity there, among the whispering pines, and it would call us back, in the form of Caleb's voice, until the end of our days. It was the hottest summer day we'd had all year when my so-called friend Lisa asked me to accompany her to the county fair. I should have known something was off when she insisted we ditch our group and go alone. Just us and the blazing sun, dragging our shoes through melting asphalt as vapors seemed to rise like ghostly fingers around us. After a couple of hours enduring the heat and overpriced rides that seemed to spin on forever, I found solace in the form of a shimmering ice cream truck, its presence a beacon of hope in the undulating waves of heat. I splurged on a double scoop of cookies and cream, the cold sweetness melting perfectly against my tongue, easing the fire that lived in my chest. Lisa had scoffed at the idea, her face twisted in mock disgust as she turned down my offer to get her a cone. "I can't bear the calories," she said, inspecting her reflection in the small mirror she always carried. But now, as we strolled past the Ferris wheel, its chains groaning like echoing whale songs caught in storms, she changed her tune. "Let me have a lick," she said suddenly, her eyes glinting in a way that made my grip on the cone tighten involuntarily. Perhaps it was the outlandish request or the way she said it, half command, half supernatural demand, but a chill snaked down my spine not unlike the frost of the treat I held. "No," I said simply, with a laugh I hoped sounded nonchalant, but in truth, her bizarre entitlement to my dessert had triggered a primal sense of protectiveness over such an innocent pleasure. Her smile faltered slightly, a storm brewing beneath her mascara-laden lashes. A rustle of whispers seemed to swirl between us, though the fairground was sparse, nearly deserted but for the echoes of distant screams of joy and terror from the rickety roller coaster. It was as if the air hung heavy and pregnant with something unsaid. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice lilting upwards like the cracked notes of an untuned piano. "It's just one lick, don't be such a control freak." But beneath her words lay an undercurrent I'd never noticed, and suddenly the world seemed slightly askew, like a picture frame hung deliberately askew so your eyes would constantly twitch. "Yes. It's mine," I blurted, fully aware of how childish it sounded but driven by some instinct I couldn't ignore. Her eyes flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows on the ground. A gust of wind wrapped around us, cold like a lover's absent touch in the solitude of night. The air felt thicker, as though teeming with something unseen and intangible. Lisa pursed her lips, a daguerreotype of discontent flashing across her face, and for a disorienting moment, I thought I glimpsed something behind her eyes, a ripple of darkness, an ancient emptiness, that seemed to reach out like tendrils from an abyss. Just for a moment, the fair's noises dimmed, the vibrant colors drained away, and I felt inexplicably hollow, my heart pounded with an urgent pulse echoing inside my head. Her gaze pierced through me, and without words, she somehow commanded an awful dread. "It's just ice cream," she repeated slowly, her voice reverberating like stones skipping across haunted lakes. Her persistence unnerved me, and every fiber of my being screamed that her insistence was far from normal, laced with an unnatural insistence that transcended the simple act of sharing. "No," I replied again, firmer this time, pulling the ice cream cone closer to my chest like an ancient relic warding off unseen evils. Her face, A perfect mask of frustration, twisted momentarily before smoothing back into placid beauty. Yet, her eyes flickered, as if suppressing some arctic ferocity lurking beneath her skin. Time dilated between us, and I swear shadows slithered with malignant cadence across the fraying edges of my perception. "Fine," she said finally, her voice an unexpected melody of defeat, and the shadows retracted, leaving me with the buzzing tension of cicadas and sweltering silence. I expected her to storm away in predictable anger, but instead, she lingered, her smile unwavering, as if she were communing with something that lay between the folds of reality only she could perceive. Something wicked brushed against my consciousness, sly and serpentine, whispering untold truths and promises in a language I couldn't understand. With growing unease, I watched as she turned, retracing our steps, her figure seemingly fading into leaden clouds as she walked away. An oppressive weight lifted, and I inhaled sharply, only then realizing how shallow my breaths had been. I felt no victory, only an unknowable loss as I cradled my rapidly melting solace, dripping unwasted onto the earth. But as Lisa disappeared amidst the throng of swaying bodies, I noticed a curious thing. A chill emanated from her previous presence, frost spread across the ground in her wake, glistening like shattered glass or the teeth of a malevolent winter. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, questioning my sanity. And that night, as I lay in bed, dream sitters perched upon my chest, pressing silence into my broken dreams. She visited me again, countless voids swirling in her ever-demanding eyes, whispering cryptic tendrils of sounds that tugged at the seams of my reality. Over and over, the haunting mantra of "it's just ice cream" rung louder than the tormented wails of long-forgotten souls, and with each reiteration, I grew more convinced that not all who wander through shadows emerge the same, for some shadows carry themselves as invitations to nightmares. It was when I could no longer discern waking moments from the nightmares that took root deep within my slumber that I realized her request was never about the ice cream, it was a test of possession, a sinister key to untold doorways. Now every night, that familiar whisper toys with my sanity, and somehow I know, a simple lick would have bound me there, in her grip, forever enslaved to whatever entities she served. Am I the asshole? Maybe. Or perhaps not, because this was never as sweet and simple as ice cream, was it? The tension began long before the first family member arrived, the kind of tension that seeps into your skin, a slow itch that gnaws at the edges of your happiness, and I was determined to ignore it. My cousin Jamie had invited us all to celebrate her engagement, and as the designated baker in the family, I decided to make the cake. Not just any cake, but a towering chocolate masterpiece, layered with hidden raspberries and a frosting so rich it shimmered under the kitchen lights. It was my pride and joy, an edible piece of art, and I was sure it would bring smiles and crumbs upon the faces of my relatives. As I arrived at our quaint little house nestled at the edge of a dreary forest, everything seemed perfectly normal, or as normal as family gatherings get. The air was ripe with the scent of evergreen trees and impending rain. I hauled the cake in its delicate crate up the stone steps, each one groaning under my hesitant weight, and the first red flag waved the moment I entered through the door. There was an air of condescension that clung to the room like static electricity. My aunts, my cousins, and even Jamie, each seemed caught in some hushed conspiracy of smiles and whispers. I shrugged it off, assuming it was the typical family gossip milling about until my brother, Mark, approached me, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Nice cake," he sneered in that sibling rivalry tone I'd long since despised. "Hope it holds up. You remember last time, right?" Referencing a family reunion long past where a similar cake had collapsed due to his pranks. I chuckled nervously, setting it on the table, steadying myself for the actual gathering. The afternoon trudged along, and conversations swirled around tiny, irrelevant sparks of jealousy and past resentments, culminating in a palpable undercurrent of hostility directed primarily at me, or more precisely, at my creation. The cake sat untouched, a lone island of sugary delight in a sea of savory morsels. Each appraising glance it gathered from my relatives felt like a jab at my very essence. As dinner wrapped up, the sky grew darker, and the rain began to patter against the windows, a rhythmic reminder of the storm brewing inside. It was then, a moment before the planned cake cutting, that Jamie pulled me aside, her smile too plastic to be genuine. She stumbled awkwardly through a few pleasantries before dropping the bomb. "We decided not to serve the cake," she declared, her voice a blend of sugar-coated malice. Apparently, Tom's mother insisted on a homemade dessert. Tom, the aloof fiancé, stared blankly from the kitchen, his mother's shadow looming beside him, a gingerbread witch with a cutting glare. Silent and invisible blows struck my confidence, and I knew my crisp defenses couldn't withstand this assault. I watched as Jamie turned, signaling her mother-in-law to bring forth some sad assortment of store-bought cupcakes. The coup de grace was unexpected, they made no attempt to hide their mockery. My brother, leading the Snickers with his usual boorish charm, was joined by airily chuckling aunts as they sliced into the cupcakes, smacking their lips with over-exaggerated joy. I felt myself disintegrating under their gaze, whispers echoing louder, "It's over the top. Who does she think she is? Some drama at every party." Their words wrapped around my heart, squeezing every last bit of warmth. The impulse to flee surged like a primal instinct, and as if possessed, I moved to the table with methodical precision. A sense of clarity washed over me, one that comes before the storm, a resolve unshakable by the babbling crowd. I picked up the cake, my symbol of joy turned stigma, and walked out. Voices rose in incredulity behind me, but I paid them no heed, their cries as insignificant as the rustling leaves underfoot. The storm outside greeted me as a kindred spirit, the rain mingling with tears unbidden. I stumbled towards my car, the cake precariously balanced in my aching arms. The doors slammed shut, muffling the jeers and accusations, an embrace of pure silence. I drove, hands shaking, the road a ribbon unfolding, leading me away from that den of wolves. Disbelief twisted with solitude, and somewhere amidst that rainy night ride, reality took on the guise of nightmare. My eyes, blurry with rain or maybe tears, caught fleeting glimpses of white figures flitting through the forest lining the road. Ghostly shadows skittered between trunks, their forms long and spider-like, twisting the peaceful woods into something unnatural. I felt their eyes on me, hungry, probing, as if the forest itself had turned against me for my audacious escape. Just ahead, an ancient sign partially swallowed by the overgrowth emerged, a solitary warning, "Turn back." Yet I couldn't stop. I wouldn't. I had left the gathering with more than just a cake, I had unearthed something deeper, something more sinister hidden among my family. What if this was the price? To always carry the peculiar isolation, never completely belonging? As the car grumbled down the winding path, I realized the forest seemed alive with whispers, each droplet of rain tapping out a melody only I could hear. The figures drew closer, their forms gaining mass and purpose. They beckoned. I pressed harder on the gas, a feeble attempt to escape both my past and the peculiar darkness lapping at my heels. At last, the road opened, surrendering its grasp to the quaint outline of a gas station drenched in the glow of gaslight. It stood alone, an isolated pocket of reality, offering an unfamiliar relief. Pulling into its lot, I breathed deeply, clutching the cake as if it were an anchor. Inside the dimly lit restroom, I removed the box's lid. The masterpiece remained untarnished, a reflection of resilience. I marveled at it amidst the tiles and the fluorescent hum. The cake's opulence brought a hopeful thought, maybe it wasn't about the celebration, but the act of creation itself. And as I left the gas station, dissolving back into the inky night, the forest revealed its secret. It wasn't hollow nor threatening, it whispered a kindness, a reminder that sometimes leaving means surviving. The cake stayed with me, every bit as sweet and defiant. The real journey was in admitting that the past wouldn't destroy me. The first time I heard them, I dismissed it as an unsettling dream, but the screams chased me into wakefulness, clawing at the edges of my sanity. I live alone with my teenage son, Ethan, in a dilapidated two-story house, where creaking floorboards and sighing walls sing a chorus of loneliness. It was a Thursday night, long past midnight, when the silence was torn asunder by a cacophony of cries, echoing in the inky blackness outside my window. They were not just any screams but heart-wrenching, visceral wails filled with despair and agony, as if somebody's soul was being ripped asunder. I shot up in bed, heart racing, a cold sweat plastering my shirt to my skin. Perhaps it was a nightmare, I convinced myself, breathing deeply, trying to quell the panic roaring in my chest. But as the minutes crept by, the screams persisted, coming in waves, and with each one, the notion of dreaming faded into the background of a dreadful reality. Ethan was the next person I turned to, hoping to find solace in the fact that he too heard the haunting cries. When I rushed into his room, I found him sitting upright in bed, his eyes wide, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Yet, when I questioned him, his response was disconcerting. "Mom, you're just hearing things," he said with a dismissive turn of his head, his voice low and unfazed. "You're not well. Maybe you should see someone." His words cut deeper than the screams themselves, sticking into me like a barbed hook. Could he really not hear what seemed so deafening to me? I left his room, feeling a creeping chill settle into my bones, an eerie sense kneading at the fringes of my thoughts. Maybe Ethan was right. I slumped back into bed, hypnotized by the relentless rhythm of the cries until exhaustion took me under. But the next morning, serenity greeted me with such deceptive bliss, you'd assume the night before never unleashed horrors upon me. Yet the unease remained, nestled in the back of my mind, stoking the fires of my doubt. Ethan carried on with his morning routine with a peculiar nonchalance that seemed almost artificial, and I watched him with a scrutinizing eye, as if trying to discern some crack in his demeanor. It was Saturday by then, which meant spending the day under the same roof, and tension hummed just beneath the surface. As evening drew its inky curtain over the town again, I braced myself for the recurrence of those screams, my unwanted companions. They returned, predictably, as if on cue with the passing of midnight, their intensity unyielding. A familiar dread coursed through my veins, louder now, taunting, mocking. Ethan, meanwhile, continued his act of ignorance, a facade that began to fray my nerves. I confronted him, desperate, hoping for some acknowledgement, a shred of belief in my experience. "Mom, seriously, you're scaring me," he said, his eyes glazed, yet his voice laced with an undercurrent of irritation rather than concern. His insistence on my delusions began gnawing at my credibility, bending my perception of reality. Was I truly spiraling into some uncharted insanity? Or was something more sinister silencing them? Days bled into nights, each one mirroring the last in a macabre symphony of screams and silence. I found myself wandering the house at night, pacing the corridors like a restless specter, clutching a kitchen knife, the razor-sharp cold comfort against the opaque terror outside. On particularly brutal nights, the screams seemed to emanate from within the house itself, reverberating through the walls like a malignant presence. Driven by desperation, I turned to more drastic measures, delving into every potential source of the noise, casting accusations at our antiquated plumbing, the cantankerous howl of the wind, even clandestine intruders manipulating our minds. Yet each deduction crumbled under scrutiny, leaving nothing but raw fear. The question now was not whether the screams were real, but why only I perceived them. Then, seeking validation outside our home, I reached out to neighbors, children linked to that very atmosphere, who, too, claimed they heard nothing unusual. Confusion escalated into paranoia, every shadow seemed an apparition, every corner a breathing entity plotting its unveiling. As a last resort, I rigged the house with recording devices hoping to capture the elusive veil, leaving them running overnight. But dawn broke my last tether to reality. The tapes captured silence, an ambient void untouched by my nocturnal horrors. Convinced I was on the brink of madness, I hesitated to revisit Ethan's claims of my illness. Was my mind betraying me, curating a desecrated phantom show? My paranoia reached a fever pitch, each scream a crescendo in the symphony unraveling my mind. I considered admitting myself for psychiatric evaluation, perhaps there lay my salvation, when a troubling thought struck me. What if Ethan was orchestrating a grand deceit, manipulating my perception of reality? Could this detached coolness cloak something deeper? One night, resolved and driven by bloodhound instinct, I followed my son as he slipped quietly into the shadows of his room. Silently, I watched through the crack of his door as he placed an odd device against the wall, a makeshift speaker of sorts, a detail sharpened in the haze of moonlight filtering through a window. My heart pounded like a war drum against my ribs as a bracing revelation vibrated through me. Could it be, Ethan was the architect behind this haunting soundtrack, entrapping me in narratives of sickness while subverting reality? Questions brewed within, but I didn't confront him just yet. Instead, I waited for nightfall when he thought I was asleep. That Saturday, as the clock approached midnight, I snuck into his room, prepared to witness whatever sick game he waged. The device whirred softly under his palm as I stepped closer, a dull mechanical heart driving the screams into our walls, feeding their spectral lifeblood. "Ethan," I whispered, and his body jerked in acknowledgement, the device slipping, crashing into silence. The raw shock on his face reflected the madness simmering within the walls of our house, a betrayal that transcended mere explanation. Everything I knew twisted in an instant, a kaleidoscope world fragmented, and the promise of sanity dangled beyond reach. My son's eyes conveyed fear, malice, or perhaps a protectiveness that did not align with the reality I'd constructed. "Why?" I croaked, a plea for comprehension, a question expecting nothing more than confession. Breathing heavily, Ethan whispered, "I wish you didn't force me to this, Mom. You don't realize how sick you are. I'm trying to help." With those words, my universe collapsed. The madness was not just external but coursed within, his reality casting doubt on mine. Was this his attempt at obliterating illusions I had spun? The boundary between truth and deception dissolved, and I found myself alone in unescapable labyrinths of conviction and delusion. Perhaps the screams weren't a figment of the physical world but manifestations meant to cure me in some brutal, uncharted therapy. I stumbled back into my room, the device. Ethan's revelation continued casting shadows long after the screams ceased. As I lay in the dark, there was no solace, only a growing awareness that the screams, whether brought on through deception or disturbance, were a clarion call upon my very soul, signaling that beneath this veneer of normalcy, something far more unhinged awaited its turn.